Tavis Smiley. This is KBLA Talk 1580. Our phone number 1-800-920-1580. 1-800-920-1580. We thank Katrina Vandenheuvel for spending an hour with us unpacking the announcement last night from Donald Trump that he is once again on the political playing field and seeking his party's nomination to the White House. As I said and Katrina said, we both think that he's a bit delusional about a lot of what he had to say last night, but you cannot take this guy for granted. You cannot ignore him. He must, in fact, be taken seriously, and so we will see in the coming days exactly how the media covers and processes his being back on the field. In our third hour today, we'll be joined by Kid and Play. There's a reboot of the House Party franchise, produced, in fact, by LeBron James and his partner Maverick Carter. That new project hits movie theaters, I think, January 13th. But we've got the originals. Christopher Reed and Christopher Martin join us in the third hour of our program today about House Party. And it's iconic. It's classic, particularly for those of us of a generation. All the House Party movies were pretty funny, and we'll be joined by Christopher Reed and Christopher Martin once again in the third hour of today's program. In this hour, now more than ever, America is being forced to have a real conversation, a reckoning, in fact, about white supremacy and white domination. But have you ever wondered where the notion of whiteness comes from? What does it actually mean? What is whiteness for? John Bewan of the Center for Democracy, Documentary Studies, will talk about democracy, but he's with the Center for Documentary Studies at Duke University and host of the popular podcast, very popular podcast, Seen, that's S-C-E-N-E, Seen on Radio. He joins us in this hour for a conversation about the roots and meaning of whiteness in a democracy called America. A quick word about John's work, and we'll get him on the line here and get this conversation started. He is, again, the host of Seen on Radio. It's a two-time Peabody Award-nominated podcast that I love because it dares to ask big, hard questions about who we are really and how we got this way. As you know, listening to this program regularly, I'm always raising this notion of who are we really, not who we say we are, but who are we really. And that's why these elections matter, because they give us a chance to try to understand better who we are really. And what we say oftentimes does not match up with who we really are. As I said yesterday on this program, it's not about the ideals, the ideals that we profess, but more about the crazy ideas that we see being embraced in parts of this country, from California to the Carolinas. So who are we really? These are the kinds of questions he's asking. I said yesterday that America has grown older, but we've not grown wiser. We've grown older, but we ain't grown up. And this is the kind of work that John Bewan does every time he puts a podcast out from Seen on Radio. And so he did it was just fascinating, and you should check this out. He did an entire series called Seeing White, a 14-part series on the podcast called Seeing White, nominated for a Peabody Award. It's a magnificent and delicious piece of work, and I am delighted to have John Bewan join us in this hour to unpack what he's done in this series and this notion of whiteness more broadly. John, good to have you on, sir. How are you?
Oh, wow, Tavis, thank you so much. That's a very gracious introduction, and I'm pleased and honored to be with you.
No, you have earned it, brother. You've done some brilliant work, and as I said, you asked us some tough questions.
Thank you so much.
I used the phrase a couple of days ago on this program, we have some hard questions that need to be asked in this country that require some heart answers, hard questions that require heart answers, and I love the way you're sorting this out for us and unpacking it. Let me just start with this one. We'll jump right in. Give me the backstory. Yeah. I'm always curious about the backstory for how these things come to be. So tell me how you decided and where the notion came from to do this 14-part series called Seeing White.
Yeah, well, thank you. The first episode of the series goes into this a little bit, and one of the things that I try to do in that series, and that's reflective of kind of what I'm up to as well, is to kind of own my positionality. I'm a very white guy, and for a long time I worked in public radio for a long time, which I know we have that in common. Sure. And did a lot of reporting that I kind of thought of as being about race in America. including, for example, summer of 1964 Mississippi Summer Project, and I did a lot of reporting about race in the places where I lived and where I was reporting, Minneapolis, North Carolina, etc. So I thought, but that usually involved, pointing my microphone at black and brown people and sort of like, oh, how's this community doing with respect to some issue like, education or the economy. And there was always this kind of underlying sense of like, how are black and brown and other indigenous folks doing given given what some elephant in the room, given that we are a profoundly white supremacist country, and that was not usually put on the table in a very direct way or interrogated very directly. So what was going on, in the 2010s, from Trayvon Martin's murder to Michael Brown and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement and Oscar's so white, and then you get the rise of Donald Trump as a serious candidate for president. This guy, honestly, it became, these things just were sort of mounting in my mind as a journalist. And I was aware, not deeply aware, but I had been hearing for quite some time about, what's sometimes called whiteness studies, that there were academics mostly who were sort of looking at race and racism through the prism of understanding, understanding the concept of whiteness, that this is a made-up thing, right? And how does it function, and who first told this story about there being a group of humanity that we're going to call white? And obviously it is inseparable from the idea that we're going to call a large chunk of the human race black, right? And that was sort of the first division. So anyway, how did that really go down, and who did it, and let's kind of tell that story. So I started to have these ideas for doing it. I had no idea. Excuse me. I had this few thousand downloads a month coming from Duke University, and I thought, well, if I do this whiteness series, am I going to lose half my audience? Half of my very small audience. And very much the opposite happened, and it was really the thing that put the show on the map, and the audience grew 20-fold and then 50-fold, and that was I guess gratifying and surprising to me.
I should tell the audience that since the launch of Scene on Radio in 2015, the program has now received more than 9 million downloads. And that's a whole lot of downloads since 2015, and a good chunk of that, as you just heard John say, has come courtesy of this 14-part series on his podcast, Peabody nominated, called Seeing White. There's a lot to unpack in this hour. I've got John for the hour, and when we come forward, I want to come right back to the comment that he made a moment ago, and that is that America is a profoundly white supremacist country. A profoundly white supremacist country. I have a very simple question for John Biewen, which is how a guy, as he put it, who is really white, ever wraps his brain around being able to say that. I mean, just think fundamentally how the conversation in this country would change if every white person I know, every white person you know, could actually utter that simple phrase, that America is a profoundly white supremacist country. Just imagine for a moment how that would fundamentally change the conversation about race in this country if the good white folk could acknowledge and utter that particular phrase. We'll come right back to that and a great deal more with John Biewen of Scene on Radio. But today, he's on KBLA Talk 1580.
Be sure to like and follow Tavis Smiley at The Real Tavis Smiley and get Twitter updates at Tavis Smiley. The conversation continues when we come forward.
Sanctuary of Hope invites you to come out, support Homeless Youth Awareness Month at a candlelight, interfaith prayer, and youth voice reflections, Tuesday, November 29th, 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. For more info, visit thesoh.org. Did you know a housing crisis puts young people at huge risk of more violence and trauma? And right now, young people and their children need support more than ever. Prevention services such as financial assistance, education, employment support, and mental health well-being are main drivers of impact. Contact thesoh.org for more information. Did you know an estimated 4.2 million youth and young adults experience homelessness, of which 700,000 are unaccompanied minors? The pathway to functional zero is prevention. More info at thesoh.org. Again, thesoh.org.
Sinai, we're honored to be named the #1 hospital in California and the #2 hospital in the nation in U.S. News and World Report's Best Hospitals Honor Roll. We're also proud to be named #1 in 6 specialties in Los Angeles. Thank you to our physicians, nurses, academic leaders, and thousands of other team members who bring their best to Cedars-Sinai every day. Learn more about our top-ranked care at cedars-sinai.org.
Families have always worked hard to accomplish the dream of home ownership. In this competitive market, Rocket Mortgage can help. A verified approval can give you an edge with sellers. Your finances have been approved, so they'll know you're a serious buyer. So when it's time to buy that house and make it home, Rocket can. For more information, call 888-900-0409 or visit rocketmortgage.com.
A verified approval is based on an underwriter's analysis of your individual financial information appraisal and title report. Cost information and conditions equalizing lender license in all 50 states. NMLSconsumeraccess.org. Number 30.
Where can you light up the tree and the savings? Lowe's, actually. Find deals on endless festive holiday decor, like 20% off all pre-lit artificial trees and endless gifts found only at Lowe's. Like the new Cobalt 257-piece mechanics tool set for $99, valued over $600 if purchased separately. Check back daily for deals during at Lowe's. Home to any possibility. Offer valid through 11/16. While supplies last. Selection varies by location.
Let's unpack a little bit more with Tavis Smiley. The conversation continues right now.
So, John Beeman, how does a really white guy who grew up in Minnesota come to be so comfortable uttering the phrase that America is a profoundly white supremacist country?
Well, it's a long journey, as you can imagine. I'll try to make the answer not too long, but I had some advantage in, I suppose, in getting to that point. For example, even in my beginnings, my parents were, kind of good liberals, and my father in particular, who's a high school English teacher and basketball coach, he was very, even though we were living in a place that was overwhelmingly white in southern Minnesota, he was very interested in questions of race. As a child himself, he'd been inspired and really kind of moved by the story of, he was a big baseball fan. He was moved by the story of Jackie Robinson. Like, wait, what? I mean, as a teenager in the 1940s, what? This man is, this is like, this is a big, he's black, and he stayed interested in those issues, and he was the kind of school teacher who would teach, To Kill a Mockingbird and Raisin in the Sun and so on. And it was talked about in my family. So I kind of was interested in that and broadly in issues of social justice, and then that led in I suppose to my, ending up pursuing a career as a public radio reporter and documentary maker. And I continued to report on these things. I'm just very interested in this, the story of this country and the sort of attempt that the country was supposedly trying to make in being a place where everyone has the same opportunities and is treated equally, regardless of their so-called race, ethnicity, background, and so on, and our deep, deep failings in that. That's something that's interested me for a long time. Yeah. But then, as I say, there was really another kind of layer or level for me, fairly late in my life, in my 50s. In our last exchange, I commented on in the 2010s, turning to this project and going much deeper with the work of folks like Nell Irvin Painter, who wrote The History of White People. Ibram X. Kendi, he's best known for books like How to Be an Anti-Racist, but this big history book he wrote, Stamped from the Beginning, was also just deeply eye-opening. And that kind of work that took me into kind of a deeper understanding of how, first of all, what racism is and how it functions, that it's not just about, this kind of lingering old-fashioned prejudice that developed in a kind of organic way in humanity, and that it's much more a structural set of systems that were put in place, economic, political, and social systems that were put in place to advantage some people and disadvantage others, and the reasons that those things 500 years ago still persist today. Mm-hmm. And it's functioning in pretty much the same way. So just a kind of deeper understanding of how kind of wired racism and white supremacy are into our systems and our institutions, and just seeing that with more clarity and being able to just say so, right?
So you mentioned public radio and the thing that we have in common in our careers, having both worked for and with NPR. And I know as well as you do, and perhaps better than you do, because I'm an African American. Obviously, I know what it's like being a black man, on NPR, and what it takes to build an audience. And I say this with humility, but as you well know from my background, when I got on NPR, the show became so popular that I got moved to mornings in most major markets, including New York City. That's a big deal to be on in morning drive in major markets, but my program just took off at NPR after some time, and I say after some time because at first people were not willing to hear a voice that sounded like mine on national public radio. We're so used to that sound. This is national public radio, and that's not the way Tavis Smiley presents. And so initially there was resistance to my voice on NPR, and eventually people came to give me a listen and to hear what I was trying to bring to them, trying to get them to re-examine their assumptions, trying to get them to expand their inventory of ideas. And I'm grateful to say that for the time I was on NPR, it was quite successful. I ended up leaving NPR. I ended up leaving NPR because I thought that I was becoming the spook who sat by the door. I did not want to be the only African American in that enterprise. I was pushing NPR to put more black folk on their board, pushing NPR to put more black folk on the air. That wasn't being met with the kind of response I wanted. And so I walked away from NPR and made a big stink about that and caught some hell for doing that. But I thought it was the right thing to do, to put public radio on the spot, because all of our tax dollars go to pay for public radio. And so I harmed myself in some ways, stepped away from a huge platform, which I enjoyed having, to try to cast a brighter light on the fact that people of color were not being regarded by NPR or by PBS, for that matter, in the ways that we should be. I digress on that point, but I raise it for this particular reason. I know that I was then, and you were then, talking to an overwhelmingly white audience of listeners. You're no longer on NPR. You're doing this podcast called Seen on Radio, and I haven't seen the data on it, but I'm sure you and I can agree that the overwhelming number of people in your audience are probably white listeners, white folk who check out your podcast. If I'm right about that, if you think I'm right about that, to what do you attribute the fact that so many, many white people in this country have listened to this, podcast, this 14-part series, Peabody nominated, about whiteness in America? Like, what is it about the work you've done, about what you're laying out in this series, that makes white people interested in hearing your critique of whiteness in America?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's what, and I said before that I was surprised, and I thought I've got a few thousand listeners. Am I going to lose half of them if I do the series on whiteness? And very much the opposite happened. I do think I don't have actual data on the audience, and I do hear from people of every shade who like and appreciate it. But yes, I assume, and I think based anecdotally on who I hear from, that it's probably a pretty large majority of the listeners are white. Why? Well, there is clearly a subset of the white population in this country that is, and I guess I would say that it's like me, sincerely interested in these issues, sincerely interested in social justice, sincerely wanting to learn, to understand better how this all works and what the real roots of the problem are. Mm-hmm. And if I am for every time, whether it's like a Apple Podcasts review or an email or a social media post that where white people use words like transformational or even life changing, and it makes me blush a little bit when somebody says, your podcast changed my life, and I want to, calm down a little bit, but I do get a lot of these kinds of comments, and I think the way that we structured that series, and I really want to mention my friend and main collaborator on the series, Chenjerai Kumanyika, who's now at NYU, media scholar and podcaster and artist and activist. There's something I think about the alchemy of the way that we approach the questions and the way that we kind of patiently and calmly go through these explanations, obviously with huge help from the work of folks like Nell Irvin Painter and Ibram Kendi and the Racial Equity Institute folks, but to just kind of step by step, without bashing, without making incendiary statements, but just trying to understand and just trying to tell the truth and try to look at what really went down here. That there's quite a few white folks who are prepared to hear that. Fortunately, I think it's nowhere near the majority of white people in this country, but it's a sizable group.
Yep. I've got 3 minutes, John, before news, traffic, and sports. Let me start. Give you a chance to start your response to this, and I'm certain we'll continue on the other side. But I want again, it's a 14-part series. We can't unpack all 14 parts, but take a few minutes to give me and the audience a sense of what white folk are hearing. What are they learning about whiteness when they listen to the series? What are they learning?
Yeah, so we start after we kind of broach the questions and introduce the ideas and so on. We start with a really blow by blow of how the idea of a white race was invented. And as I said before, that's inseparable from the invention of the notion of a black race. And Nell Irvin Painter, the wonderful historian, now emerita of Princeton, she takes us step by step through and points out, for example, that it wasn't until about 400 or 500 years ago, that anybody was talking about these ideas. That people clearly, yes, all through human history, people have divided themselves, right, by religion, tribal group, language. It's you and it's them and us, right? And people have done that. But this idea that there are 3 or 4 or 5 big groupings of the whole, somehow meaningful, black, white, Asian, these things that we live with now, that's a recent invention. Really only 400 or 500 years ago. So that's a really important starting place. And then how did it go down? What were the steps of the construction of that idea? And we sort of take folks through that, and guess what? The original inventors basically were slave traders.
I was just about to ask who benefited from that construction.
Yes, and so basically, and we talk. Ibram Kendi talks about a guy in Portugal in the 1450s who really seems to have been the first to start to kind of lump together all of the people of Africa to talk about them as inferior as a group, and so you have there in that idea. And this was somebody who was writing a book about a heroic explorer and slave trader who was the first from Western Europe to go down directly, take ships down the west coast of Africa, and haul people, capture people, and haul them out. And haul them back into enslavement in Europe. And it's a book celebrating this guy's great achievement. And this is the first time that there's some of this language that's sort of describing African people as all one group. Let's think of Africa, vast, diverse continent, really. But to lump all of Africans together as superior and they live a bestial life. He uses this kind of language.
Hold that thought right there. Hold that thought. They are black. They are inferior, and they're living a bestial life. We'll come right back to that point. Our guest in this hour, in case you've just tuned in, is John Bewan. We're talking about the notion of whiteness, where it came from, what it means, what's it for. John Bewan has a wonderful podcast called Seen on Radio, but he's just hosted a 14-part series on the podcast called Seeing White, nominated for a Peabody Award. I love his work. I love his witness, and he ought to be celebrated, as many people are, for the work and witness of this project, this 14-part series called Seeing White. A great deal more to talk about with John Bewan when we come forward after news, traffic, and sports on KBLA Talk 1580.
Courage is contagious. We're KBLA Talk 1580.
I'm Mike Moore, and here's the latest from the Black Information Network. 2 Los Angeles County Sheriff's deputies who shot and killed a black man in 2020 won't be charged with a crime. The LA County District Attorney's Office says the deputies acted in self-defense when they shot 29-year-old African-American Dejon Kizzy 16 times. Kizzy was originally wanted for riding his bicycle on the wrong side of the road, then fled on foot. The DA's report says during the struggle with deputies, Kizzy dropped a pistol and was shot while trying to pick it up. The shooting sparked several protests. Now, a history note on this date. In 2000, civil rights leader African-American Hosea Williams died at the age of 74. Williams worked closely with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. during the civil rights movement. And that's the latest. I'm Mike Moore from your 24/7 news source, the Black Information Network, and BINnews.com.
In Sherman Oaks, we've got a wreck working on the 101 southbound at the 405. Still heavy traffic there from Tampa Avenue. You're seeing delays on the 405 South Drive, Sherman Way down to Getty Center. Heavy on the coming away from the 110 out to Robertson, and on the 10 eastbound at Fairfax, an accident clearing to the right shoulder.
NetSpend All Access. Get the mobile banking account with perks that add up. Banking services provided by an account established by Pathward NA. Member FDIC. Deposit account opening is subject to registration and ID verification. Terms and costs apply.
This is the KBLA Sports Minute with Ray Richardson.
The number 1 girls high school basketball player in the nation is going to USC. 6'2" guard Juju Watkins of Sierra Canyon High School in Chatsworth signed a national letter of intent to attend USC in the fall of 2023. This young lady can ball. She was the starting guard for the USA basketball 17 and under team when they won 2 gold medals. She's one of only 5 high school basketball players in the country with a name, image, and likeness endorsement deal with Nike. Watkins, who grew up in Watts, is the great-granddaughter of Ted Watkins Sr., the legendary LA civil rights activist in the 60s. The Clippers lose by 2 in Dallas last night, 35 for Dallas forward Luka Doncic. No debates, no speculation, just the info you need. That's your KBLA Sports Minute. I'm Ray Richardson. This sports report was brought to you by MVP Accident Attorneys. When it comes to your settlement, we're slammed up. Call check their website at themvp.com for a free case review.
When you're the victim of a car accident, hiring the right law firm can be the difference between a rewarding settlement and striking out. Call the pros at MVP Accident Attorneys at 833-MVP-WINS for your free consultation.
Call me your MVP.
Leaving things half done, not a good look. Like a half-done hairdo.
All done.
Shouldn't the curls be on both sides? A half-baked peach cobbler.
A gummy crust? I don't think so.
Or a half of a domino.
Bam! Big 6!
But where's the other half? Don't go halfway, especially with your immunity to COVID-19. Stay up to date with your vaccines and boosters. Visit myturn.ca.gov to find one near you. Brought to you by the California Department of Public Health.
Follow the leader. KBLA Talk 1580. Be sure to follow us on Instagram at KBLA 1580.
Follow the leader. Are you ready?
The station leading the way with exclusive interviews.
Follow the leader.
Stimulating conversations and intellectual discourse that empowers, enlightens, and informs.
Follow the leader.
Follow the leader at KBLA 1580. We've got a lot to talk about.
Keep following the leader.
Follow the leader. Follow the leader. Follow the leader. Follow the leader. Follow the leader.
KBLA Talk 1580. We've got all.
Ira
here for KBLA Talk 1580. We're live in Los Angeles at JP Morgan Chase's Advancing Black Wealth Tour. And I'm speaking to some of the attendees today to see why it was so important for them to be here.
I find it important to be here as a business owner and entrepreneur because I want some more capital, and I'm not really a fan of loans, so it's really interesting to see how people have gained wealth and the different spaces to advance my money in, whether it be stocks, digital.
Now, why do you think it's important for companies like Chase to promote building generational wealth in black and brown communities?
I mean, it's important to me as one of the biggest banks in the world to promote black wealth because most banks don't really, in my opinion, care about the money that I'm spending as they would, opposed to a white counterpart that might have the same dollar amount in their account.
Well, you can bet on Chase offering insights on financial health, the path to home ownership, and entrepreneurship. It's the Chase Advancing Black Wealth Tour.
This is KBLA Talk 1580, where hate loses and love wins.
We continue our conversation now with John Biewen, the award-winning host of Scene on Radio. He has completed a powerful and provocative 14-part series on his podcast called Seeing White, and we are continuing our conversation now about this notion of whiteness in America, where it came from, what it means, what it's for, and where we're headed in this country vis-a-vis the issues of white supremacy and white domination a day after Donald Trump announces that he's running once again for the White House. When we stepped aside a moment ago for news, traffic, and sports, John, you were teeing up this story about how this whiteness narrative was constructed with a particular individual early on who helped advance this notion that we were black and we were bestial. Pick up where you left off, sir.
Yes, a man named Gomes de Zurara, who was a Portuguese writer in the 1450s, writes this book, and it's a celebration of the life of a guy named, he's usually known in English as Henry the Navigator, relative of the king of Portugal, and was a kind of voyager and one of the first to send ships down to Africa directly to bring back enslaved African people into the slave trade in Europe. And so Zurara, as Ibram Kendi puts it, he basically he was the first to, in a way, invent the notion of a black race in the way that he characterized African people across kind of regions of Africa and differences in skin tone and whatever. He sort of lumps them all together as being an inferior race. And this is new, because I think now we sort of think, oh, well, no matter how far back in history you're going to find these ideas, right? Well, no. There were, very respectful exchanges and relationships between Europeans and Africans in the pre-colonial time, and there were people who wrote admiringly about, the Mali Empire, the Songhai Empire, or so on, these West African as rich and as quote unquote civilized as any place in Europe, and much more so than lots of places in Europe. So that you're now going to declare in the 1450s that all Africans are inferior and live like beasts, this is a slander and a lie. And it's really a new kind of assertion. Well, why would he suddenly be doing this? Not because it's some, honest observation, but because they're trying to justify this new thing that his book is glorifying, which is, we've just figured out this is going to be the thing now. This is going to be the economic model. We're going to go enslave a whole bunch. So this is really the pioneering and the launching of the centuries-long African slave trade from Europe.
How did that narrative, John, take hold? So you get one guy who's, all it takes is one, obviously. We know that from Donald Trump, right? It just takes one. So how did this one guy put this narrative out and have it take hold? How did it catch on, so to speak?
Yeah, so and it might be oversimplified in a way. I think in a way, I would probably characterize it as the Andy is making here is that this is where you start to see this kind of characterization. But it was something that the book certainly circulated among the elite in Portugal, and then you started having others in France, Spain, England, that sort of started following Portugal's lead. First of all, in going to Africa for enslaved labor, but also in using this kind of language and this kind of idea and perpetuating the notion of a superior white race and a superior black race. It still was another 100 or 200 years before that particular language of black and white people came into wide usage. But the concepts, Kendi would argue, that's where it coincided with the start of what was going to turn out to be a huge world, development in the world, the African slave trade.
What happens a couple hundred years later, as you mentioned a moment ago, John, that opens the door for the broad use in our vernacular of white and black?
Yeah, so a couple of major forces, if you're sort of going to boil it down. One is the scientific revolution, right, where you had this new kind of push in Europe to kind of codify and describe and explain, just categorize the natural world, right? So you have Linnaeus, who gave us that whole thing of the kingdoms, of the animal kingdom and the plant kingdom and all. Then we're going to break it down into all these branches and so on, right? That's happening, and we're going to kind of organize and understand nature in a new way. And so at that same time, then you started to have people saying, well, let's look at the human race, and instead of saying we're one species, period, and come in different flavors, they essentially picked up what the slave traders had created and adopted because these ideas about a hierarchy in the human race were already floating around the culture. They picked that up, and you started having people like there's this Blumenbach, who's a German, sometimes called the father of anthropology, who writes a book where he says, okay, there are 5 races, and it's not just that there are 5 different races, but there's a hierarchy. And guess what? People who look like me are at the top, the white people, because they're the most beautiful, for one thing. He says that's one of his standards for superiority. Black people are at the bottom, Black Africans are at the bottom, and then he has a few categories in between. Americans, meaning indigenous people in North America. And there's a group that sort of roughly coincides with Asians, and another group I forget. But that was the other. So you started having people organize things in this way, and there was always a hierarchy because it was Europeans doing it, and white supremacy was already baked in to the ideology of the culture, right? And then the other thing that happens is, and here you get into North America and the U.S., particularly in colonial America and then in the United States of America, legal structures that are codifying these ideas. And it's literally the first 2 laws that the United States passed after the first Congress took their seats in 1790, where one was the Census Act, which said we're going to count the population every 10 years, and we're going to categorize them into the groups of white people. There's like white men, white women, white people under the age of 60, and enslaved people, and other free people. Like these were the categories, okay? So you're putting it into, and the second law was the Naturalization Act, which said you can come and be an American, then join us as an American if you are a free white person. That's right. So, and there were, of course, we could go on. There are hundreds and thousands of laws in colonial America and in early America that are making these divisions in the and then other groups, indigenous and so on.
I've made the point more than once in my career that in many ways, to my mind, America was a corporation before it was a country. A corporation before it was a country. And when you hear what John just shared with you, you understand why I use that phrase so often in my work. And it's just fascinating. And we know that at the founding of this country, our documents were pro-slavery. The founding documents of this country were pro-slavery. We all know that. But it is fascinating to hear John Beaver, which is why I love series like these. It's called Seeing White. It's a 14-part series on his podcast, seen on the radio. But it's fascinating to hear and to just be reminded, or to learn if you didn't know, the first two laws that Congress ever passed. And what he just laid out for you. Those were the first two laws that our Congress ever passed. And you wonder why we are in the malaise, the mess that we are in. You wonder why racism is still the most intractable issue in this country. It literally goes back to the first two laws that Congress ever passed. I digress. You're listening to KBLA Talk 1580.
We've got a lot to talk about. Good thing we've got 3 hours. More of Tavis Smiley when we come forward.
Higher gas prices meant oil companies made massive profit. Maisha Cairo here with your K-Black Minute News, brought to you by MLK Hospital. The average for regular gas is $5.46 at the pump, with $5.80 for premium. Meanwhile, local refiners like Phillips 66 and Marathon report profit increases up to 1,243% higher than last year. Governor Newsom was reported to say that big oil is making record profits by, quote, ripping off Californians, end quote. Penalties for this price gouging will put profits back into taxpayers' pockets in the form of a direct deposit refund. I'm Maisha Cairo, and that's your K-Black Minute News. Let us know your thoughts on this by tweeting us at KBLA 1580. When you have your baby at MLK Community Hospital, they will work hard to make sure you and your family have the experience that you want. MLK Hospital welcomes your new baby.
What like you? Yeah.
Thank all of our subscribers for their support throughout the years, proudly serving the South Los Angeles and South Bay areas for more than 40 years. The California Crusader is a multicultural, black-owned, adjudicated newspaper that focuses on providing newsworthy information to the people in our community. We're constantly looking for ways to assist businesses in our community to connect with our subscribers. We provide low-cost, effective ways to promote your business with our reasonable and affordable advertising rates. You can participate by suggesting, sharing, and submitting your stories on the California Crusader newspaper Community Share Facebook group page, or visit our website at cal-cruise-news.com. That's calcruisenews.com. Then click on the Submit Now button located on the top right corner of the homepage, or text CCN to 42828. Again, text CCN to 42828. The California Crusader newspaper, working together to build a better community for our future. Subscribe today.
This Sunday and every Sunday is the African Marketplace and Drum Circle Community Market. Get free groceries, essential resources, and buy black from local merchants of arts, beauty, custom black merchandise, and more. Choose from a wide variety of cuisines, custom-made clothing, jewelry, and a lot more. Experience the true essence of Africatown at Leimert Park every Sunday from 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. Join the Drum Circle, dance, enjoy live performances, connect with Black Excellence every Sunday in Africatown and Leimert Park. You can find us on Degnan Boulevard near Vernon and Crenshaw in the heart of Africatown at Leimert Park. That's the African Marketplace and Drum Circle Community Market. Join us for music, shopping, food, and fun this and every Sunday. Support black businesses, recycle black dollars, and feed your soul. The African Marketplace and Drum Circle Community Market every Sunday in Africatown at Leimert Park. Brought to you by Africatown Enterprise and the African Village Vendors Association.
Find a righteous range, and don't be afraid to say what you see. For KBLA Talk 1580.
Yeah, we all just took a deep breath here in the studio. Miles is here, of course, every day. JD, my producer, is here every day, and the three of us are just looking at each other, staring at each other during that break. Given what John just laid out, again, for those of us who are students of history, you sort of know this, but when you get reminded again of these first two laws that were passed, And then you start asking questions about why black beauty isn't seen the way that white beauty is. You start asking yourselves why there's a divide in this country racially on everything from education to housing to employment, to other opportunities. You start asking yourselves why black, police, and the list goes on and on and on. And all of these issues that we are wrestling with in late modernity, in real time, are rooted in the founding of this country and the ways in which whiteness was advanced. And that's why we're asking these tough questions. At least John is asking these tough questions about the notion of whiteness and where it came from and what it means and what's it for and why has it existed and expanded and survived and thrived all these many, many centuries. Why? And again, I love and respect so dearly the work and witness of John Biewen in this wonderful series called Seeing White, 14-part series on his podcast, seen on radio, again, nominated for a Peabody Award, and it certainly ought to be. There's so many learnings, so many takeaways. I asked earlier in this conversation, John, the kind of responses you're getting to the series, and you shared some of that. I specifically asked why white people would listen to a series like this and what they were taking away from it. But I know that everybody's listening to this series, including black folk like me and JB. So a whole lot of folk are listening to your series. What are you hearing specifically from black folk? What are you hearing from black listeners of this series?
Yeah, I think if I were to kind of sum it up, I would say that if you say that there are kind of two big takeaways from the series. And by the way, I just want to mention this series came out in 2017, by the way. So,
exactly.
And we've done some stuff since, including a season on American democracy. But and sometimes it's funny. I've had people say when they hear that Seeing White came out in 2017, there were folks in 2020 with all the sudden reckoning interest in racism and white supremacy. There were people saying, "Well, that's prescient to do a series on white supremacy before 2020." And I said, "No, it ain't prescient. It could have been. It was late. Anytime in the last 400 years, we could have done that series, and it was right to do." But anyway, you asked about the reaction. If there are kind of two big takeaways from it. One, white supremacy is deep and pervasive and baked into all, the institutions and systems of this country. And number two, that here's how it all went down. Here's what it means. Black folks know that first one, right?
Yeah.
Overwhelmingly. But the second part about, just what step by step,
how it went down, how it went down,
right? That is something that I hear a lot of appreciation from black people is, okay, that, and in a way when you were asking this question, why, is this sort of like, okay, now, first of all, I'm not crazy, right? That I live in a society that's deeply racist, and that you've helped me understand kind of blow by blow how it got this way. And also, I guess the other thing I would say is that sometimes, and this actually really moves me, is when black people say, it actually means a lot to me to hear a white person saying these things this clearly, because it actually gives me a little bit of hope, and that's very moving to me.
Yeah, Bill Clinton had a line some years ago, and he and I discussed this a number of times in our private conversations. President Clinton, over the years, he had a great line when he did his race commission, and John Hope Franklin was the chair of that commission, as you recall. Speaking of Duke, the late great John Hope Franklin, out of Duke, was chair of that commission, and Clinton had a great line that says, "Racism is white America's burden, even though it's black America's problem. It's our burden, even though it may be their problem." And so that's the point that Clinton is making, is what you hear from these black people, that they love and appreciate when somebody white says these things. We know this stuff. But the way you're unpacking it for us and how we arrived at this place is a beautiful thing. John sort of spoiled what I was going to tell you at the very end. The series did come out in 2017. I didn't want to tell you that to the end. And I wasn't going to tell you that because the reason why I wanted to have John on today is because of Donald Trump's announcement last night. I know where we are headed. Speaking of prescient, you ain't got to be prescient to know where we're headed in the next 24 months. It's going to get uglier. It's going to get nastier. It's going to get more violent. And I'm not calling for anarchy. I'm just telling you that's what's about to happen for the next 24 months. I wanted John on today so you could hear the work he's done in this series and see the relevancy of it from 2017 even to today, 2022. That's why I wanted John on. But now the secret's out. It came out a few years ago, but I wanted him on today for the obvious reasons. Our remaining moment with John Beaver when we come forward on KBLA Talk 1580.
A safe place to go loud. A great place for progressive politics. KBLA Talk 1580. KBLA Talk 1580. We've got a lot to talk about.
KBLA Talk 1580. Fight, we win. Community Coalition trains activists and organizers in order to support power building with Black, Brown, Indigenous, and people of color. Community Coalition works to help transform the social and economic conditions in South LA that foster addiction, crime, violence, and poverty by building a community institution that involves thousands in creating, influencing, and changing public policy. Founded by Karen Bass in 1990, Community Coalition was born as an African American and Latino organization with the goal of turning hopelessness and despair into action. The activism of the Community Coalition's members and community residents has almost solely stimulated economic recovery in South LA for decades, generating billions of dollars by redirecting them to South LA schools and foster care. In addition, Community Coalition offers amazing mind, body, soul resources, advocacy, and policy work, and has a robust and active membership body. To become a member, get a referral, or get support for your nonprofit, visit cocosouthla.org. That's cocosouthla.org, or call 323-750-9087. This is a community call to action from KBLA Talk 1580.
What's in this box? Is this tree good for climbing? How are babies made? What does this thing do?
Kids are curious about everything, including guns. Talking to them about gun safety in your home is a good first step, but you can do more. Always keep your guns locked, unloaded, and stored separately from ammunition. Safe gun storage saves lives. Learn how to make your home safer at endfamilyfire.org. That's endfamilyfire.org. Brought to you by End Family Fire, Brady, and the Ad Council.
The Los Angeles Urban League helps African American and others in underserved communities achieve true social parity, economic self-reliance, and civil rights. For over 100 years, Los Angeles Urban League has ensured our communities have access to careers with living wages, opportunities to start and grow businesses, and clear pathways to personal and professional growth. Programs like BizCamp, Construction Career Academy, Spa Business Ready, and B-Warp. The Black Wealth Attainment and Retention Program are examples of the ongoing events designed to make our centennial mission to rebuild Black Wall Street right here in LA a reality. To sign up for our newsletter or to support the Los Angeles Urban League with your time, talents, and donations, visit laul.org. That's laul.org. The Los Angeles Urban League is a proud sponsor of Urban Family Focus, Saturdays at 7 a.m.
Conversations that matter. You're listening to Tavis Smiley on KBLA Talk 1580.
I've got 2 minutes left, John Beaver. I've got 1,000 more questions, and those are just mine, not including all the ones I'm seeing on our platforms, things that people want to ask you. So we have to have you back at some point. But in the 2 minutes that I have left, in this hour, which I've immensely enjoyed and been empowered by and informed by, I want to close where we began, with you uttering that phrase that got this conversation started, that as a really white guy, you were able to admit and to acknowledge that America is a profoundly white supremacist country. Profoundly white supremacist country. The exit question is, will it always be that way?
Well, I certainly hope not. And I think, one of the things, and we've talked some too about white people, my predominantly white audience, and what I always say is, we don't have to convince all the white people. We just need to convince enough, right? And in a country where, so it's really a question, and this is also the kind of thing that Ibram X. Kendi emphasizes, which is it's about power. It's about changing the policies by kind of putting together the power to do so, and then the kind of the attitudes and so on can come along behind, because that's the order in which it happens, right? We get the cause and effect reversed. It's not prejudice comes first and then people make bad policies. No, people make racist policies because of money and power.
That's right.
And then the attitudes are the result. So we need just enough white people to join black and brown and indigenous people to change the policies and the power structure. And then, then racism as an attitude problem can fade away over time.
And there you have it.
I think it's possible.
And
we're a long ways from it, but it's possible.
Well, as Jesse Jackson says, keep hope alive. You might be more hopeful than I am, but we're going to keep hope alive anyway. His name is John Biewen. He's the host of a very popular podcast called Scene, SCENE, Scene on Radio. The series we've been discussing in this hour is called Seeing White, a 14-part series on the podcast, nominated for a Peabody Award. Look it up and check out all 14 episodes. Hard to do justice to that kind of work and witness in depth, but I thank John Biewen for coming on. John, all the best to you, my friend. We'll do it again somewhere down the road.
Thank you so much for having me, Tavis. It's been an honor.
My great honor. Hour 3 of Tavis Smiley. It's a house party with Kid and Play on KBLA Talk 1580.
KBLA 1580 Santa Monica.
I'm Mike Moore, and here's the latest from the Black